Hi, welcome to the third video. Today we will be discussing the king in chess. The king is the most valuable piece on the chessboard. The game is all about the king. When the king is threatened, we call that check. When the king is threatened by check and cannot escape, we call that checkmate, and the game is ended. Now the king, like the pawns, can only move one square at a time. But unlike the pawns, the king can go forward and backwards. The king can move one square to the side, to either side. He can move forwards diagonally. He can move backwards diagonally. So from any square in the center of the board, the king has 8 squares in a circle around him that he is allowed to move to if those squares are empty. Now the king's movement is restricted and governed by the rules of check. For example, the king is not allowed to move into check. If this king moved to this square, this pawn threatens capture. The king cannot move onto a square where he is threatened with capture, because remember, in chess, we never capture the king. So he is not allowed to move into check. If this pawn moves forwards, he checks the king. When the king is in check, he must get out of check. Black would not be allowed to move a pawn while in check. Check trumps everything. The king must move out of check. Now, there are 3 ways to get out of check. We'll discuss 2 of them today, and I'll introduce the third tomorrow. The king can move out of check. He can move like that and get out of check. Or he could move back here and get out of check. He cannot move here because he would still be in check by that pawn. But let's say he moves back here. This pawn comes up and says check. Now the king has a choice. He can move or he can capture the checking piece. Those are 2 ways out of check. Moving the king or capturing the checking piece. Kings cannot check each other. A king cannot move onto a square that is adjacent to the opposing king, because that would be moving into check. If this king moves here, he's threatened by the other king. So you can never have kings close next to each other, square to square. Sometimes we call that kissing kings, and that is not allowed in chess. The kings cannot check one another. A great way to practice king and pawn moves is to play the king and pawn game. This is very much like the pawn game I introduced last week, only now you have the kings to help gobble up the pawns and to protect their own pawns to promote. You win the game when one side gets a pawn all the way to the other side to promote to a queen, a bishop, a rook, or a knight. The game is tied if you get down to just 2 kings or to a position where nobody can move. Now, just like regular chess, in the king and pawn game, white always moves first. Very important to practice at home with any of these games is to practice some of the other rules of chess. One of the rules is touch move. When you first touch a piece, the very first piece you touch, you must move that piece. If you touch your opponent's piece, this is the rule of touch take. I've touched this pawn, I've touched my opponent's piece. It means I must move this pawn and I must capture my opponent's piece. That's the rule of touch move, touch take. Also notice the way that I move. I use one hand. I capture the piece, and with the same hand, I take it off. In chess, we use only one hand. The other important rule that kids need to know is that you only get to touch the pieces when it is your turn. Both players don't get to touch the pieces at the same time. It's about taking turns. One of the great skills that young children learn, one of the great life skills young children learn in playing chess, is impulse control. They learn to look, think, decide, and then touch a piece before they move it. Next week, we will be discussing the queen.